Our next speaker is Jonah Birch. He's speaking on the European radical right, between mobilization and electoral populism.
So I also wrote a 4-page talk that I was going to go over, which I also have to spare you as we do our tour of the far right in Europe. I wanted to start, I wanted to start with Greece. With France, not with Greece. In France, where in 2012, in the presidential election, the leader of the National Front, Marine Le Pen, got 18% of the vote, 6.5 million votes. That was about 1.5 million more than her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, had gotten in 2002 when he made it to the second round, the runoff of the presidential election. Mainly because the turnout was much higher this time around. Now, Marine Le Pen famously is known for, on the one hand, trying to modernize the National Front after she took over from her father when he retired in 2011, in a way that disassociated it from some of its links to the sort of historical, to interwar fascism, to Poujadism, to the traditions of the far right in France and in much of Western Europe. On the other hand, also known for her vitriolic anti-immigrant racism, and of course for, in particular, targeting Muslims, got quite a bit of attention for, among other things, comparing Muslims praying in the streets of France to the Nazi occupation, which is quite a comparison, obviously. The thing that's so striking about the 2012 election and her performance in the 2012 election was not just the number of votes that she got and her success, and which she's translated into quite a bit of momentum since in the run-up to the European parliamentary elections that will be in May. She's polling about 23, the FN, the Front National, is polling about 23%. But what was so striking about the 2012 election was that Marine Le Pen got 30% of the working class vote in France. Now, that made the National Front the biggest working class party electorally in France. And that actually wasn't a new phenomenon. Even by the late 1990s, the National Front had sort of emerged, had this breakthrough in 1983-84. By the late 1990s, people were already talking about that the party is the working class party par excellence in France. They've won over a huge chunk of the electoral base that 30 years ago, in France, they all would have been voters for the Communist Party, for the PCF, and certainly would have been voters for the left. And this is emblematic of a larger trend in the far right in Western Europe. There's quite a bit of scholarly literature on the radical right populist parties that have emerged, really all over the region, particularly in Western Europe. Maybe later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they spread to Eastern Europe. But they emerged in Western Europe at the beginning of the 1980s and have very unevenly but steadily gained traction in country after country since. So, these are parties like the Austrian Freedom Party, the Swiss People's Party. Often people will include regionalist parties like the Liga Nord and the Vlaams Blok, the Vlaams Belang in Belgium, in this family of parties. And in Scandinavia, the progress parties, these anti-tax, what had emerged in the 70s as middle-class parties, and then later increasingly took on this sort of nationalist xenophobia that really defines the far right in Western Europe today. And this is the far right as it's developed. These radical right populist parties, they've evolved quite a bit. They've changed their positions. These parties vary quite a bit between them in a whole bunch of ways. They've changed positions on a whole bunch of questions. Then the National Front, when it emerged in the 1980s, when it gained prominence, was intensely neoliberal and actually quite sympathetic to the project of European integration. Obviously, that is no longer the case. They are not for European integration, and actually, Marine Le Pen is quite an aggressive critic of sort of neoliberal finance capitalism. She's very clear to say she's not against the market, but what she's against is the sort of unfettered market that she believes has undermined French democracy and exposed, she always says, I don't support the working class, I support French workers. Exposed sort of French workers to all the pressures of international financial markets, the ups and downs of the world economy today. As these radical right-wing populist parties have evolved, they've taken on a character that I think is very distinct ideologically from some of the parties in the past. Marine Le Pen, when she's attacking Muslims and immigrants, the way she frames them, not as the way she poses her racism, is not in terms of the sort of biological racism of the Nazis, but in terms of cultural difference. And, she'll say, there's a great quote from her, that she's like, I'm not against anyone else's culture. Where is it? She says, I want Malians to remain Malians and defend the language and identity of Mali, Americans to stay Americans, the Chinese, and the French. She embraces difference, cultural difference. She just, as opposed to the liberal multiculturalism that says of that difference, we all need to get along, she says, yes, if we go into different parts of the world, don't come over here, and then we will, we'll all get along. And when she's framing, this sort of existential threat to French civilization, the things that she talks about are increasingly things, and this is true for a whole set of these parties in Western Europe, things that traditionally were associated, if not with the left, then certainly with sort of European liberalism. So she presents herself as a defender of French secularism, and of feminism and gender equality and of Republican democracy against the Muslim hordes whose culture is fundamentally incompatible with all of these things. It's a big break, even from her father. I mean, it's been a big shift, and it's been part and parcel with her turn, the National Front's turn, towards a strategy that is increasingly and essentially entirely electorally oriented. And here I want to pose a question. Okay, I'm going to be done before that, since I just locked off my entire talk. I want to pose a question I think that there are two big questions that we have to ask ourselves about this. One is, how is it that these parties have been able to make such headway, have been able to seize a whole chunk of the social base that historically would have been associated with the left? And I think to pose it in terms of, clearly the starting point is what's the restructuring of European capitalism and democracy, world capitalism since the 1970s. But I think that just begs the question, why haven't these the people who have lost out from that process been as attracted? Why haven't we been able to make those sorts of inroads among that kind of base? After her performance in the presidential election, Marine Le Pen was challenged in a local parliamentary election by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of the left party in France, who had come in fourth in the presidential election. She had come in third. He had gotten, I think, 11% of the vote. He said, I'm going to go challenge her, very charismatic leader. And she was running in this working class constituency in northern France that had been devastated by deindustrialization and the restructuring since the middle of the French economy, since the middle of the 80s. And she had more roots there, but he was getting quite a bit of attention, a lot of purchase for his message nationally, and she crushed him. I mean, she doubled his vote. I mean, I think that it raises a question for us about what is it that is attracting workers to this kind of message so consistently, actually, across large swaths of Europe. It's not enough just to say that these radical right parties have taken up the mantle of opposition to sort of European integration and the sort of neoliberal austerity that's gone with it. Actually, some of these parties remain quite committed. Like I said, they vary quite a bit among themselves. The Norwegian Progress Party is a xenophobic nationalist, but also still quite neoliberal anti-tax party that also has gained an enormous base among Norwegian workers in what was traditionally one of the bastions of social democracy. I think that there are some hard questions there for us, that are very important to think about. The other question that I want to pose is about what the relationship is between these parties and what we've thought of as fascism historically. And I think that there's a silly way of thinking about why these, what the fundamental difference between these parties and some of the more fascistic currents that were their predecessors, the difference between them. And that, that is to focus on the sort of ideological, just the sort of rhetorical appeals. The National Front isn't, aggressively militaristic and expansionary in the same way as fascism was. Marine Le Pen constantly expresses her support for democracy. I don't think that's enough. If that was the difference, then I would say, okay, you can say that these are all the same kind of parties. But the Golden Dawn, the emergence of the Golden Dawn in the last couple of years, I think it exposes, or it reflects a break, a really big difference. And for left commentators historically, there was an understanding, at least for many, that what defined fascism more than anything was its ability to mobilize a mass base on the ground through grassroots activity, through these sort of paramilitary organizations, exactly the sort of thing that Golden Dawn does and that the National Front does not, and that these parties in Western Europe don't. I mean, they're almost all electorally oriented, and when they've come to power, and several of them have, all as members of coalition governments, but the Austrian Freedom Party, Jörg Haider, the Liga Nord obviously was in Berlusconi's coalition. In a couple of places, they've been sort of external supports in parliament for minority governments. They've essentially functioned in the same way as the bourgeois conservative parties of Europe today. They're quite racist, but so is the sort of traditional conservative right. Anti-immigrant politics is not unique to the radical right, populist parties at all today. In fact, you could say that they've been quite ineffectual in a lot of ways, and they've what the scholarly literature says is that they've consistently failed to make any significant changes in policy, at least in any sustained way. Well, that's really, that's obviously much different than what fascism did, between the wars, where what we were talking about was not, very right-wing governments. We were talking about the destruction of the left, and the labor movement. I mean, that's a big break. I think that's worth, worth us thinking about and what that means, because I think that actually these parties represent a slightly different kind of challenge for the left and raise a slightly different set of questions for us.